Good morning and welcome to the Changing Workplace presented by Liani Reeves and John Stellwagen. My name is Christian Boyd and I will be your session moderator for today. If you have questions for our presenters, please ask those using the Q&A box, which you can find below by clicking the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you would like to chat with other attendees, let the group know which district you're from, or simply want to say hello, please use the chat function, which can be found near the Q&A option. I will collect questions as they are submitted and ask them of our speakers at the end of the presentation. You can click the like button next to other attendees' questions to upvote them, which will indicate that you would also like the question answered. At the end of the session, please visit the session page with the platform within the platform to complete the session evaluation. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Liani Reeves and John Stellwagen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Morning, everyone.
Okay, thank you for joining us for the Changing Workplace, how the pandemic, protests, fires, and an election will alter the workplace. We'll start with some introductions. My name is Liani Reeves, and I'm an attorney with the firm of Bullard Law. My practice specializes in assisting primarily public agencies, public bodies in litigation, advice, and investigations. John, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, and my name is John Stellwagen. I'm an attorney with Bullard Law as well. I am primarily specializing in employment and labor law, and primarily working with public sector clients as well.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to cover a lot of content today because, 2020 was a busy year and we're anticipating that 2021 is going to look a little different. So here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about sort of what does the workplace look like post-pandemic, talk about the impact of George Floyd on the workplace. The video that we just saw from the advertiser talks about the wildfires and just sort of lessons learned from that. And then we had an election and things are going to look a little different going into the future. So just to set the stage for our conversation, though, 2020 was a year that was filled with, tragedy and just a lot of anxiety and stress. As we know, COVID was the United States, 2020 was one of the deadliest years in history. Over 3 million people in the United States died, 350,000 of them from COVID. As of yesterday, 264 people had died from COVID in the country and 2011 in Oregon. Black Lives Matter and the social justice movement, it was one of the largest movements that we've seen in this country. It peaked on June 6th when 500,000 people turned out to the streets in almost 550 different places across the country to protest. Wildfires, as we know, it was one of the deadliest fire seasons that we've seen. 7 people died, over 1 million acres burned, 40,000 people evacuated. And then, of course, we had an election, to sort of close out our year. And it was an election with the participation rate was higher than ever before. 157 million Americans went out and cast votes. Turnout increased in every state, including Oregon. So it was a year that was just full of, so many things, and it's going to change the way we operate as employers, as districts, as a community going forward. So the first thing we'll talk about is the future of work post-pandemic. What might it look like? How might things change? This is going to be a high-level overview. First of all, just setting the stage. So at this point, 33% of US workers are working remotely 100% of the time. So that's about 1/3 of the US workforce. That's down from April of 2020 when half of the workforce was working remotely. 25% are sometimes working remotely and 41% are back in the workplace. Going forward, though, we know that COVID-19 and the forced work from home and shutdowns, really forced employers and workplaces to be innovative and to pivot quickly to new ways of operating the workplace. And it forced some innovation that allowed employers and businesses and districts and government agencies to think creatively, to be innovative, to embrace technology. That is going to be opportunity that will continue going forward, and companies and governments that can capitalize on the efficiencies, the technology, the innovation that we were forced to do during the pandemic are going to have a great advantage going forward. For those who couldn't adapt or who won't adapt or want to go back to the way it was, that's just not going to be the reality for most people. And in order to attract and retain talent, you're going to have to keep that, catalyst for change, for innovation and flexibility going forward. Because employees will continue to work from home. There was always sort of, I think, a resistance before that we can't do it, that it's not going to be efficient, that people won't be productive, that we can't monitor the workforce when they're working from home. But once, it was forced to happen in so many workplaces, it's going to be hard to take away. And nearly 2/3 of US workers who have been working remotely would like to continue to do so. And over half, or just a little bit over half of US workers said that they would leave their current job for one that allowed them to work remotely going forward. So the takeaway there is that employees are going to continue to expect flexibility, which means management is harder, right? Because if people aren't working in the workplace, you lose visibility and control over what they're doing. And so you need increased trust of your workforce, of your employees. And in order to do that, you need to sort of set the stage and you need to set expectations. So in terms of managing a workforce that is going to continue to work remotely, allowing that flexibility, which will really allow people to sort of capitalize on the efficiency and the innovation that we've seen coming as a positive out of the pandemic. Expectation setting is going to be key. So you're going to have to set expectations for people of what is the workday, what you expect in terms of when they are available for meetings, for telephone calls, to be online, other team activities, whether they're optional or not. Monitoring and responding to emails and messages. When people are working from home, that boundary between work and home is, much less. And so you need to set expectations about when are they expected to be available, because you still have an obligation to pay them, if they're working more than the set hours that they're supposed to work normally. So you need a way to track that. As we go forward, you're also going to see an increased emphasis on, how do you make people able to work from home efficiently? And that's going to be on home offices. And lots of companies are going to, investing in people, allowing them to have a stipend or reimbursement to set up their home office. I think when people went home last March, they didn't expect to stay home necessarily. And lots of people, including myself, were in a makeshift office on a makeshift desk, with my dining room chair, which I'm still using. That going forward is just not going to be a feasible model. Efficiency is gained when people are working comfortably and efficiently from home. So if any part of your workforce is going to continue to work remotely, you're going to have to invest in making sure that they are set up to be able to do so in their homes. And as I mentioned, a lot of companies, we've seen this, have been providing workers stipends so that they can go out and buy equipment, they can buy an ergonomic chair, or they just do reimbursements for that. Because again, this is going to be not only a way to keep your workforce efficient, but also those types of stipends and reimbursement policies will help build employee loyalty and also attract talent. Because as you'll recall a few slides ago, 54% of the people said that they would leave a job for a job that allowed them to work from home. So this is actually a great opportunity to attract talent if you can adopt to this new model. But, of course, legal obligations still apply to work from home. So wage and hour issues, non-exempt employees have to be paid for time worked. Meals and breaks are required, and, they must be paid overtime. So as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, setting expectations about what is the workday is really important, and having a good system to track time. Harassment and discrimination still apply. You can, be liable for harassment and discrimination that happens in a virtual workplace. That could happen, because people are getting harassed over video, or people are being treated disparately because of, whatever the situation is. Maybe it's assumptions around whether or not employees can adapt to technology is going to dictate whether or not they get, the best assignments. That kind of differentiation might lead to a discrimination claim. We still have accommodation requirements and obligations when you work from home. So you still have to comply with the ADA, engage in an interactive process to help and see if you can find a reasonable accommodation for people who are working from home. And workers' compensation will also be an issue as well. And this goes back to that expectations around when is work, what is the work time, what are the standards for the work office, getting them that equipment to make sure that's ergonomic and not a hazard, have a teleworking policy that clearly defines what is expected of them and when, and what is work, what are hours of work and scope of work, so that people can determine down the line, if there's an injury, was it incurred in the scope of work. It's all going to get a little bit more tricky, but these are things that, employers who want to capitalize and want to continue to be competitive with a workforce that's, really moving towards an innovative future. These are just some of the things you're going to have to look at. Management competencies are also going to shift a bit because, again, when you have employees that are out of the workforce, you can't manage them in the same way. You can't just walk down and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. You can't just check in with them, throughout the day at the coffee table or something. So you need managers that have a strong sense of trust of their employees, that can engage and empower their employees to, set expectations and follow them. You're going to need managers that can manage the technology side, because you still want them engaging in employees over Zoom or other video platforms to keep people connected and build that network within your team. Managers need to be flexible because, as we know, working from home, there's just so many unpredictable things that happen. So managers need to be able to be adaptable, to be flexible, and to be empathetic for all of the different demands that are placed on our employees when we are working in this different environment. And that's just, this is just sort of a summary of that, sort of the management of your employees is with less oversight and visibility. You're going to have to replace that sort of control that we typically have with trust. We're going to have to look for new ways to engage employees if, they're going to remain out of the workplace for some period of time, and new ways to monitor productivity and also to really minimize distractions, help your workforce minimize distractions to make sure that productivity is at its highest. It's important to note that, and especially for a lot of you in the special districts, you may not have a good amount of your workforce are in the category that can't work from home because they're essential workers and they're out in the field. But, this pandemic has really sort of bifurcated our economy, and it will continue to exacerbate disparities that already occurred in wealth and income. So you have three categories of people that have been through this pandemic and will be coming out of this pandemic. You have the work from home folks that were typically professionals that were able to pivot to work from home because they had the resource, the technology, and a job that allowed them to work from home. Those tend to be non-people of color that had that category of people that were able to do that. In the essential worker category in the middle, these are the people that, just because their jobs were essential, they were not able to work from home. They had to continue to go to work. They had to continue to incur the risk of exposure. And just statistically looking at the demographics of that group, it's, blue collar workers, a lot of people of color and non-white workers. And then you have the category of people that were in industries like retail that were just completely shut down, and they had neither option, right? They were just out of work. And that is disproportionately fell on women. And so coming out of the pandemic, going into the pandemic, we all already had disparities in wealth and income that we all deal with in different ways, both within our workforce and in the services that we provide. That's just going to be exacerbated as we're coming out of the pandemic. The physical office space will probably never look the same for a lot of places. The work from home has decreased the need for a lot of companies and businesses and maybe even government agencies for a physical office space. Our law firm has just downsized our space because we anticipate that a number of our staff are going to continue to work from home. That's a huge overhead savings for us, but you also lose, stuff. You lose community, you lose that feeling of team if people aren't coming in. So offices may be redesigned to have more open workspaces, sort of built to accommodate when employees are in, having them integrated and be able to mingle with each other and build team when they're in the office, as opposed to everybody coming into the office and always sitting in their own office. Health risks and just I think the pandemic has shared some best practices with companies and governments going forward. People are still going to expect that their workplaces are clean even after the vaccine is rolled out. So I think those additional health measures like the cleaning stations and the plastic barriers between desks, those things will likely be things that people will want to remain. Because the health risk is never going to be completely eradicated, and a lot of these things were just best practices anyhow that the pandemic forced us to facilitate into our workplaces very quickly. The health concerns will remain, and so even as offices are continuing or starting to open up, And, again, a lot of your offices, the workforce hasn't been able to completely work from home, but the main office might be close to the public. So you have some staff that isn't coming in. But, there's a lot of questions about, okay, when we start opening up or if we open, can we continue to do health checks even after the pandemic? Employers can continue to monitor people's health. They have to do it in a way that is equal and non-discriminatory. It's best to have some kind of stated policy so there's transparency around what is expected of the workforce. But, typically we don't want our employees coming to work sick, whether it's COVID or the flu. And so, health concerns in lots of different areas will remain, and you can continue to monitor that if that's something that you choose to do. I'm not going to talk a lot about the vaccine because that's like an entire training in itself. But as most of you know, we do have a vaccine. 2 different companies have been approved for emergency use only. It's not full FDA approval, but they are out on the market, and each state is responsible for coming up with a plan for distribution. And Oregon is currently distributing vaccines. One of the approvals of temporary authorization or emergency use authorization is that individuals who take the vaccine must be informed of their option not to take the vaccine and in the consequences of refusing. And when we start talking about whether or not you can mandate the vaccine, that language is going to be important. So can employers mandate the COVID-19 vaccine? So EEOC recently released some guidance, and they said generally yes, that you can mandate that your workforce gets a COVID-19 vaccine. There are some exceptions, both under federal law, and Oregon has some exceptions as well. One of the things that the EEOC clarified was that a COVID-19 vaccine itself is not a medical examination, so it doesn't trigger the ADA because you're not receiving any information that might, sort of disclose some underlying medical condition. However, if you're doing pre-screening vaccination questions that are necessary to make sure that somebody is able to take the vaccine without side effects, that could implicate the ADA. And there are rules around when you can ask those kind of questions. They need to be consistent with job necessity. It's a job-related inquiry, and you need to have a justification that you're asking the questions because you believe that there's a direct threat to safety or health of the person or others. There are a couple ways that you can get around triggering the ADA in this way. One is that you can not mandate the vaccine, that you can make it voluntary, so you're not compelling the information. And the second way you can do it is that you have them get the vaccine and have those questions asked in a place that's completely separate from your workplace. So you require them to go get it from their primary caregiver or a pharmacy that is unrelated to your workplace, and then somebody else is asking them those questions. So when can employers require proof of vaccination? Generally, they can't, except for a couple of exceptions. The first exception is if there's a religious reason that they don't want to take the vaccine. Under Title VII, they're able to have a religious accommodation. And under the ADA, if there's a medical reason that they can't take the vaccine, they also are entitled to an accommodation if it's reasonable. And so like any other ADA or any other religious accommodation process, it's an individualized assessment. You need to engage with the employee to find out, is there a reasonable accommodation that can be granted? And that could be they don't take the vaccine, but they're going to not come back to the workplace. They're going to work from home until X amount percentage of your workforce is vaccinated, or you can find them an alternate work location within the building that has less exposure. But you have to engage in that individualized assessment like you would in any other religious or disability accommodation context. As part of that individualized assessment, you'll have to do a direct threat analysis. And a direct threat is a significant risk of substantial harm. And this piece would come if you've decided that there is a reasonable accommodation, but you still think that there is a direct threat that compels them to get the vaccine. That's the step that you're in now. So even if you've gone through that process, but you've decided, there is so much threat to the workplace if they don't get the vaccine, this is the analysis you're going to look at. Is there a significant risk of substantial harm of health and safety of self and others that cannot be eliminated by a reasonable accommodation? And you're going to, the factors that you might look at are the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, likelihood that potential harm will occur, and imminence of potential harm, and how much of the rest of your workplace has been vaccinated might be a factor that comes into play here. So if you have a large portion of your workforce that's already vaccinated, that direct threat analysis might look a little bit different. Other considerations for the vaccine, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Right now, there's a general duty clause that applies to COVID-related hazards. You have a duty or an obligation to give a workplace that's free of recognized hazards. It's unknown what OSHA will do with respect to the vaccine. They haven't given any guidance on that yet. Much like the medical accommodation under the ADA, if you have workers that are pregnant that don't want to take the vaccine or can't take the vaccine, you'll have to accommodate that. And then you'll also want to look at your collective bargaining agreements to see if there's any provisions that would be directly applicable, or whether or not your management clause allows you to do that without bargaining or not. And then even for employers that aren't unionized, the National Labor Relations Act protects concerted protected activity. And so if employees are coming together to, for example, oppose a vaccine program, that could be protected activity under the NLRA, and you wouldn't want to take some kind of punitive action against them for doing that. Oregon has a strange little statute in Chapter 433 that specifically applies to Oregon healthcare and emergency response workers. So they're the only workers that are sort of carved out that said, there's some specific requirements for them. You must provide the vaccine or immunizations that are available and medically appropriate. It must be provided at no cost to the worker, and you may not require immunization as a condition of work unless recognized or required by federal or state law, rule, or regulation. So you actually can't mandate vaccines for certain types of healthcare and emergency response workers unless there's some state or federal law that requires it. And at this point, we're not aware of anything that would. So key takeaways for employers on the vaccine, at this point, it's emergency use versus full FDA approval. So if you're looking at mandating the vaccine, you might want to wait. I think best practice is to wait until full FDA approval. You're really going to want to get employee buy-in and union consultation and educate people about, the benefits of the vaccine, and see if you can do voluntary compliance as opposed to mandatory. You're going to want to have a policy and a procedure that's transparent so people understand the different factors around the vaccine. And you're also going to report who's vaccinated. You're going to want to report and track who's vaccinated. COVID-19 and the future impact of employers. We've already seen an upsurge in union activity. John's going to talk a little bit about, what the administration has been up to, but we think that there's going to be a lot of union activity going forward on this issue because, they're going to demand safe working conditions. So pivoting to George Floyd, 2020, we saw after the death of George Floyd, certainly he wasn't the first death to protest and won't be the last, but there was a movement around the George Floyd death that really sort of reached this heightened point in June, similar to the Me Too movement we saw in 2018. 2020 was a year where Black Lives Matter was really highlighted, not just as a movement in the streets, but a movement in corporate America and state and local government as well. Lots of governments and employers came out making public statements, monetary pledges, millions and billions of dollars towards Black Lives Matter, towards equity and racial equity and empowering Black employees and equity in the workplace. And even symbolic changes, things like, taking Aunt Jemima off the logo after she had been there for so long, because of the concern that she was perpetuating a racial stereotype. We saw lots of movement in 2020 around sort of centering the Black experience of employees. And Black employees started speaking out and sharing their experience in the workplace. And, beyond the actual movement, you have to still look at what is the reality. And the reality is that Black employees are still underrepresented in lots of different areas, and they are still underpaid if you look at the pay disparity. And so employers eventually will be held accountable by employees and by society for the statements that they made. There are actually groups out there that are tracking different companies that made pledges to, fight for racial equity within their department or within their company. And there's this spreadsheet, for example, tracks, what the company is, who made the statement, when they made it. And then they look at the actual demographics of the company. How many employees do you have? How much gross revenue do you have? And what percentage of your population or your employees are people of color or Black employees, to hold them accountable for the commitments that they made. It's important to, say not for any political reasons, but, as we saw this momentum around Black Lives Matter, there was some pushback, from lots of people, from the community, from the culture, but also the White House in particular had a executive order President Trump came out with an executive order that basically said trainings that talk about things like institutional and systemic racism and white privilege will not be done at the federal level or with federal contractors. And this was, sort of in response, because all of a sudden, with the momentum of the movement, people were talking about things like white privilege and systemic racism in a way they weren't talking about it before. And President Trump sent out this executive order basically curtailing that conversation, at least in some workplaces. It was struck down, at least in part, by a court late last year, and then along came President Biden, who, in more than 180 sort of reversal, got rid of that executive order, but also on day one issued 17 executive orders. Many of them were focused on concepts of equity, acknowledging systemic racism, acknowledging that even the government has a lot of work to do in those areas. So we've seen a complete reversal on the federal level and sort of the support for racial equity discussions in the workplace. Your employees will continue to protest, and so you're going to want to continue to respond to employees who are going to choose to protest. If they're protesting during work hours, you can enforce your uniformly applied policies regarding time off and neutral rules regarding, if they're not coming to work. You just need to be consistent in that enforcement and make sure that you're treating people the same, depending, you can't treat people differently depending on what the content of the protest was. Private employers should take steps not to violate those federal labor laws that allow employees to come together for mutual aid and protection. I talked about that, the NLRA, and then you're going to want to look at your collective bargaining agreement if you have one. If employees are protesting off duty, and they have engaged in conduct that you think is harmful to the agency, generally public employees have a right to political speech if it's a matter of political, social, or other concern to the community. There are exceptions to that. And so if you're thinking about taking action against a public employee who is engaged in conduct off duty, tread lightly and seek local counsel. There are, you can do it, but you need to show significant harm to the mission of the agency or to the authority of the agency. And then private employees actually don't have any free speech rights. And so private employers can discipline employees as long as they're not otherwise unlawful. For people who are protesting, workplace policies still apply. So again, you can't treat some protesters differently than others. Your leave and your, policies around coming to work on time, using company resources, if again, you need to apply all of these policies consistently with all of your workforce. And then COVID-19 will continue to be a concern, or other health concerns for people who are engaging in large group protests. And so you're going to want to continue to follow a return to work plan for people who are coming back to the workplace after a protest. You don't want to treat them differently. You want to treat them the same that you would treat any other employee that's coming back to work. And then lastly, I'll just say, both the pandemic and the protest movement last year, and even the election, and the fires that John will talk about, there's a workforce that has been, through a lot. We've all been through a lot, right? So we would encourage employers to embrace conversations around mental health, make sure that employees have resources, and make sure that mental health is a focus of 2021, so that employees are, on the path to move forward in 2021. So I'll turn it over to John to talk about wildfires and the election.
All right. Thanks, Liani. So, I've got two sections that I'm going to go through. The first, as Liani described, is kind of the future of work learning from wildfires, which obviously a lot of us experienced that directly here in the Pacific Northwest last year. And that combined with the pandemic, we had a rough 2020, as Liani earlier stated. And then I will follow up with that with a section about the new administration in DC and kind of what you can expect on the labor and employment side. So next slide, please. As many of you experienced, we had a wild last year with a global pandemic, in addition to kind of just unprecedented wildfires throughout the valley here, especially, but all over the state. I'm sure there are some of you in Eastern Oregon who would say we experience wildfires on a pretty regular basis. So these natural emergencies are common, relatively commonplace, and something that you're going to regularly deal with as employers, especially as special districts. You're often on the front lines with a lot of these, and these can be man-made or naturally occurring. But the critical piece here is recognizing that being prepared for the situation is and recognizing that these may pose a threat to your business, your employees, and your customers, and thinking about it ahead of time is critical to being prepared and being able to properly address these situations. Next slide, please. And so that is often the first question. And last year, I think hopefully a lot of our special districts were relatively well prepared for these things, but there were some unprecedented events that occurred. No one, I think, expected necessarily a global pandemic on the scale that we saw. And like I said, the wildfires were at a level that we've rarely seen. But emergencies create a variety of hazards for workers in the impacted area. You just don't want to count on your ability to react logically and sensibly during an emergency. In a crisis, you get stress levels and emotions that increase and cloud judgment and decision making. And you want to be prepared before an emergency by making sure that you're considering what's the necessary equipment, knowing where to go, knowing how to keep yourself safe when an emergency occurs. And critical to all of that is actually thinking about these potential disasters that can come up and making efforts to work with your workplace, work with your employees, work with your administrators to ensure that you are doing things that leave you properly prepared. Next slide, please. And that's especially after this last year, that really is the question going into this new year is, are you prepared for the next big one? You want to consider what are the steps that would help make sure that you are ready. One of those is assembling an emergency planning team or roundtabling and having with management and with your managers and staff, brainstorming worst case scenarios, figuring out what would happen if wildfires broke out and threatened your business or your operations, and how would you deal with that? And that extends beyond just natural disasters. There are issues, college campuses and community colleges, K through 12 have been for a long time planning a variety of emergency preparedness around violent threats from gunmen and so on. And so you want to take all of that into consideration and make sure that you're going through the whole list. And I know SDA often provides services in that regard to assist with a variety of emergency preparedness. You also want to recognize that OSHA can often be a resource. While oftentimes they may be seen as an enforcement agency, they also have resources for emergency planning and so on. And as frightening as these scenarios are to consider, the outcome is going to be far worse if the situation happens for which you're unprepared. And establishing a comprehensive emergency action plan where you've worked through the worst case scenarios of potential emergencies, how they would affect your operation and employees, and how you would respond is really the best way to be prepared. And so, like I said, making sure that you've roundtabled or assembled an emergency planning team and know who is going to be in charge when those scenarios arise, brainstorming what your worst case scenarios are, and as well establishing some sort of a comprehensive emergency plan. Really, these, I think, if districts are putting these things together ahead of time, is going to leave you in a much better place when one of these disasters actually does unfortunately occur. Next slide, please. In addition, you want to think about the employer obligations during a disaster. Specifically, what do you do when employees are unable to work? As we saw last year with the wildfires, you had some special districts and some businesses and operations, employers throughout the area who were shut down and for whatever reason were unable to open the workplace. They had to leave their workplaces closed. That immediately brings up employment implications. You have to start to think about, what are my obligations with employees? We're shut down right now. Am I going to have to pay my employees? And you want to think about that ahead of time, obviously. How are my employees going to handle this? How is payroll going to occur? All of those various things you want to think about ahead of time. Specifically, you end up with two categories of employees that we all regularly deal with under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Those are the non-exempt employees, or often what times are called classified employees, and then your exempt employees, those who aren't subject to overtime rules and are typically paid by a salary versus hourly. With your non-exempt employees, they're typically paid for work. Well, they are paid for time worked only. And so if you're closed, if the business is closed, the employer does not necessarily need to compensate non-exempt employees who are not working because of some sort of natural disaster or event that causes the business or the operation to have to close. It doesn't matter whether the absence is based on the employer's decision to close a work site or because the employee has to stay home, possibly to evacuate, or because their transportation isn't going to work because of possibly a snowstorm or whatever the event is. If they can't get to work or the work site's closed, you are generally not obligated to pay those non-exempt employees for that time worked. There are obviously lots of implications from that, including concerns about whether retaining workforce and so on. And we've seen a lot of that in this last year with, like Liani said, impacts on a variety of employees, especially employees of color who aren't able, due to their status as in a professional position or an exempt position, having to actually come to the workplace in order to get receive compensation. With your exempt employees, what you want to consider is that if they're working any portion of the week, if they work an hour during the week, they're going to be paid for that entire week. And in addition, you may be required to use accrued. They may be required to use accrued leave or vacation for their absence if they aren't able to work. But regardless, you want to take these things into consideration and recognize that you may have scenarios where you've got to make changes or take into consideration how your compensation is going to work for non-exempt and exempt employees. One additional thing to consider with your non-exempt employees is the on-call status. This often arises when you've got employees, especially first responders or employees who are considered essential workers. You may have those individuals in an on-call status, and you want to consider that an employee who is required to remain on call on the employer's premises is going to be working while on call. So if you've got them in a scenario where they have to be available at the office and maybe they're not actually working, but they're just on call, if they're at the workplace, they're going to be considered to be working at that point. An employee who's required to remain at home on call or who's allowed to leave a message when they can be reached is generally not going to be considered to be working. But you want to be very careful about those scenarios and take into consideration how am I making requiring this employee to be available. And oftentimes the rule of thumb is that compensable waiting time is time during which an employee is engaged to wait, not time an employee spends waiting to be engaged. But if I'm engaged to wait, likely there's going to be some sort of wage and hour implication and a requirement that non-exempt employee be compensated. Next slide, please. And so in addition to situations where the employees are unable to work for whatever reason, you also run into scenarios where you've got a business that's closed or an operation that's closed where the employer is just not able to be open. As I stated before, the employer is not obligated to pay hourly non-exempt employees in those situations, but all of those issues relating to leave then come up, and you may have scenarios where you need to make leave available and so on. So you want to take those things into consideration as well. Same with exempt employees. If the business is closed less than a full week, the employer must pay full salary. So if you've got employees working Monday, Tuesday, but then you go out on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or the opposite, you've got a situation where the employer is unable to open your Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, only opens Friday, and you call those exempt employees in and have them work, they're going to be paid for the full week. And so you want to take these things into consideration, be aware of these repercussions ahead of time, and understand, and even if it's working with your employment and labor counsel to figure out how am I working with my workforce when these scenarios arise. Thinking about these things ahead of time is the critical piece, really. Let's see, next slide, please. Then we've also got, you want to take into consideration employer obligations during a disaster, about how you're going to arrange for payment, and that we saw some of that last year, where you had some of your critical workforce that were related to HR or payroll, who were unable to get into the workplace, and a lot of employers suddenly found a scenario where, out of the blue, we weren't able to necessarily get into the office and do payroll. And obviously that raises all sorts of issues, both for the employees, but also for the employer's potential liabilities and obligations. But you want to notify immediately of delayed wage payments in writing as soon as possible if you can. You want to review your CBAs and or approach the unions to discuss those issues. And that's one of the critical pieces. If you are an employer that has bargaining units, and most of us in public sector have positions that are covered by bargaining units and labor unions, you want to be reviewing your CBAs and figuring out how you're going to deal with these obligations. But critically, you want to consider, how am I communicating with my union, the union's representatives in this case, so that I'm not ending up in a scenario where I'm ended up with grievances and ULPs filed by the union. And last, you want to consider outsourcing payroll to avoid disruption in those scenarios. And you want to have a backup plan. What if my payroll department's unable to process these payments? How am I going to have my employees paid in this scenario? And what are my backup plans if I need one in order to respond? And we are all obviously over the past year getting better with technology and so on, the meetings and the business that we're able to conduct now. In some ways, it's been beneficial in that everyone's learned how to be more flexible. Everyone's become more nimble in their business processes, but still, like I said, you want to take those things into consideration ahead of time and not be flat-footed when the incident arises. Next slide, please. And in addition, like I said, here's a kind of a checklist of a lot of the issues that are going to come up when you run into those scenarios. Employees may be entitled to use accrued leave, either under an employer's own leave policy or a collective bargaining agreement. They may be protected by the Family and Medical Leave Act to the extent that they otherwise meet FMLA eligibility requirements. And one of the specific things that I've seen arise in advising public sector clients is the recognition that FMLA regulations state that any period in which business activities have been suspended and employees are not otherwise expected to report for duty cannot be counted against the employees at 12-week FMLA entitlement. So not only do you need to consider the employees that are in the workplace or currently working, but you need to consider those employees that are out on FMLA leave, because you may have scenarios that arise where you need to stop counting the time against their 12-week FMLA entitlement. And so all of these things are things that you want to consider ahead of time and make sure that you don't run afoul of your own leave policies or laws like the FMLA or OFLA. Employers should make sure they understand how their own HR policies and any applicable laws may relate to the disaster, communicate that information to managers and supervisors so they're equipped to handle questions from employees. In addition, you may have issues arise under the ADA, reasonable accommodation, requests from employees who are physically or emotionally injured as a result of the whatever catastrophe or disaster that you're dealing with at the time. We saw this especially so with the pandemic. You had lots of employees who were either required to be quarantined or have had issues related to having to care for family members and so on, but a variety of ADA and leave issues that arise during these situations that you want to be prepared for and think about ahead of time. In addition, there's the issue of unemployment compensation and how that plays out in these scenarios. You may have, especially when emergencies are declared and employees are unable to work, you may have a number of issues related to unemployment compensation that arise. In addition, you've got layoffs. Oftentimes, a lot of employers with operations being shut down temporarily or even permanently in some cases during this last year, had to deal with layoffs. A lot of employers are going to have to, primarily in the private sector, but it does sometimes apply in the public sector as well. When you're doing large scale layoffs, you need to be thoughtful about what that process is, and in particular, the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, which is a Warren Act, called the Warren Act, which is a federal law that protects workers and their families by requiring employers with 100 or more employees to provide notification 60 days in advance of a mass layoff or a plant closing. You also want to think about your collective bargaining agreements and the fact that oftentimes you're going to have layoff provisions in those collective bargaining agreements. So if you're in a position where you've got even a small group of employees, you may need to be reviewing your collective bargaining agreement and taking into consideration your HR policies as well, as to, in determining what factors are at play here in doing even a small layoff, let alone a large scale layoff. And then lastly, one of the issues that oddly can come up even is the Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act of 1994, which is also called USERRA. USERRA generally protects uniformed individuals, people serving in the armed forces who generally have had employment and reemployment rights when they're deployed, as National Guard members or reserve members. Oftentimes, you had a number of employers who had employees called up to serve in Afghanistan or Iraq during the last few years, and USERRA provides a number of workplace protections in regards to the reemployment and employment of those individuals. Those individuals, that USERRA has recently been expanded to include what are called intermittent disaster response employee appointees. And these intermittent disaster response appointees are often civilians who volunteered to serve on a disaster medical assistance team. And a number of special districts, obviously, with first responders and so on, you often have individuals who may, through this federal system, have volunteered or either initially signed up to volunteer in preparation for these events, or when the event occurs, contact the federal government or are contacted by the federal government to serve on these disaster medical assistance teams. In that case, you want to be aware that USERRA may apply to those individuals. They may have reemployment rights, and oftentimes, as employers, we're trying to work with those individuals anyway because they're providing a service to the community. But you want to be cognizant of the fact that USERRA does cover those individuals. You may have first responders and individuals who volunteer or provide services to these disaster teams that could basically be called out of the workplace for quite a while they're helping with disaster relief or disaster response. And then you need to be aware that they've got employment and reemployment rights that are going to require you oftentimes to hold their position and whatnot. Next slide, please. Last, kind of wrapping up this section, one of the critical components, obviously, is making sure that you've got an emergency action plan in place. And because these situations have different factors, including location, type of, you've got all sorts of issues that you need to be aware of and thoughtful of, type of business or type of operation you're running, the number of employees, and situational severity. So there's not one size fits all for an action plan, but you do want to consider all of the various issues we've kind of got laid out here in this slide. You want to think about emergency notification systems. How are you going to communicate with your employees? How are you going to let employees know what is occurring? And oftentimes you want to be thoughtful about the fact that you may have employees with disabilities who aren't able to necessarily respond to a audio or visual alert, but may need some sort of tactile device to alert employees or whatnot. So you want to be thoughtful about how your notification systems are working for all of your employees. In addition, you want to think about a chain of command and who's going to be in charge if something occurs at your work site, or if your workforce is having to respond to one of these emergencies. and you want to be thoughtful about who's in charge, how are those orders and instructions going to be disseminated throughout the workforce. Then you want to think about responder protocols for those who remain to perform the shutdown of facilities or whatnot. How you're going to implement safety procedures and protocols, and even basic things like fire extinguishers and first aid. You want to think about. There is, in fact, fire extinguisher training. There's a proper way to use a fire extinguisher, and a lot of people don't necessarily have any specific training or thought about first aid or fire extinguishers until it's suddenly necessary. So you want to be including that in your emergency preparedness. In addition, evacuation policies and procedures, making sure that you have those in place. I know SDAO provides services in regards to all of this emergency planning and can often assist special districts with these. So you want to be using those resources and keeping those in mind as you're going through these. You also want to be thinking about a post-evacuation protocol. With the wildfires this last year, we saw all sorts of unfortunate scenarios where people really had to evacuate quickly, and having those plans in place obviously is going to make a huge difference. There's lots of talk, obviously, and focus on making sure that we have similar plans in place for tsunamis on the coast and so on. So you want to be thoughtful about this, make sure that you've got an emergency action plan in place and that you're taking the steps necessary. Next slide, please. And so thinking about preparedness training and making sure that you've got policies and plans in place is critical. Next slide, please. And then you want to think as well, like I said, about a business continuity plan. It ties together with your emergency preparedness plan to make sure that you're taking the operational steps to make sure that you can maintain your business or your operation, and that you're taking care of steps like payroll and thinking about how your IT infrastructure is going to work and so on. Memorializing the plan in writing is critical. Keep the plan up to date with a lawyer, ideally, and keeping all the business governance documents updated and together in one place, and making sure that you have all of that in place in case you need it. Next slide, please. So that kind of wraps up, and I want to be cognizant of time here. That kind of wraps up our emergency planning portion. But you do, again, like I said, want to make sure that you're thoughtful about those plans, that you're thinking about things ahead of time, that you're getting emergency plans in place and the business continuity plans in place. And so next, we'll focus on the post-election. And as Liani pointed out during her part of the presentation, there's been a whole wild slew of changes we've seen in the last, it's February 4th, and the volume of change that we've seen, it seems like on a daily basis, you're seeing all sorts of changes left and right here with the Biden administration coming in. And there's obviously a large policy shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. We've got a number of executive orders that have gone into place already. These are executive orders on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender, identity, or sexual orientation. In addition to executive orders on protecting the federal workplace, requiring mask wearing. So you're seeing an increased focus on the pandemic and federal input into planning in regards to the pandemic. You're also seeing an executive order on preserving and fortifying DACA. So DACA recipients who've been, DACA individuals who've been in somewhat of a limbo during the last 4 years are seeing the Biden administration come in and look to increase protections for those individuals and remove some of the uncertainty about whether they would be in a position to be in the workplace, be in school, and so on. So you're seeing an increased focus in that regard. In addition, there's an executive order that's been implemented on protecting worker health and safety. So you're going to see an increased focus in that regard. You're also seeing an executive order on promoting COVID-19 safety in domestic and international travel. You're going to see more focus on that as well, obviously. In addition, you're seeing an executive order on supporting the reopening and continuing operation of schools and early childhood education providers. And lastly, you're seeing there's an executive order on protecting the federal workforce. So all of these executive orders seem to have something in common, which is an increased presence by the federal government in the workplace, an increased focus on enforcement and compliance that was lessened during the last 4 years, but you're going to see a return to more of a vigilant, compliance-oriented focus. Next slide, please. In addition, you're going to see new management at the Department of Labor, and with that comes a renewed focus on overtime and white-collar exemptions. There's going to be impact on the joint employer regulations. You saw the Trump administration in both of these scenarios look to lessen restrictions, and you're going to see some return to making it easier to find a joint employer relationship, which is difficult for employers, but obviously employee friendly, making it easier for an employee to, if they have some sort of action against an employer, and you're in a scenario where you've got an employee that is maybe looks in your mind to be an independent contractor or employee of another employer that or a subcontractor, you may be in a scenario where it's easier for them to pull both employers in a joint employer scenario. In addition, there's going to be a tightening in regards to definitions of independent contractors, looking to increase the ability to describe those individuals as employees. In addition, a focus on tip credit, tip pooling, and lastly, and maybe most significantly, you're going to likely see an increase in the federal minimum wage. There's discussion that it's going to be raised incrementally from this current, I think it's $7.25 right now, to $15 an hour, probably by 2025. And so that's obviously going to have a wide scale impact on the workforce and employers' labor pools. Next slide, please. In addition, you're going to see, and you've already seen pretty significant changes at the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board. It's a board and an agency that's intended to be a neutral organization, neutral agency overseeing collective bargaining and labor matters. And traditionally, you've generally had, it's a 5-member board, and it shifts generally from administration to administration. Under the Trump administration, you had 3 Republican members, 1 Democratic member, and 1 vacancy. And generally, the administration that is in power has a three-member seat or 3-member representation, and the other has 2-member representation. You can see the Biden administration is quickly moving to fill the vacancy. In addition to, over time, I think the 3rd Republican member is set to their membership or their appointment expires this coming fall. So you can see by the fall that the National Labor Relations Board is likely going to shift back to a situation where you've got 3 Democratic members and 2 Republican members. So you're going to see impact from that over time. You're also going to see, and oftentimes you may wonder why, what is the impact here at the state level in that regard? Oftentimes the NLRB generally applies to private employers. It doesn't necessarily impact public sector that much in Oregon. But what you often do see is that the NLRB trickles down to IRB, that IRB's routinely looking to the NLRB for guidance, and changes at the NLRB often do trickle down to the state level. And then moving down to the current slide, a new GC as well is what originally when I put these slides together, we were thinking that the current GC, a Trump appointee, was going to hold out probably until November. The General Counsel's name was Peter Robb, who in this case refused to resign his position. The Biden administration came in more quickly than expected, and on day 1 asked General Counsel Peter Robb to resign his term early. Robb refused. He was dismissed. And then his second deputy came in, moved into the acting role, and was fired the next day. So the Biden administration's moved even more quickly than people expected. Like I said, when I first put together these slides, I was expecting that Robb was going to be in place until the fall, but we've already got a new general counsel at the NLRB. That position's quite significant because they're the agency head in charge of investigation and prosecution of unfair labor practice cases and the general supervision of the NLRB field offices, which are the field offices scattered throughout the country that process unfair labor practices, claims, and so on. And as such, the position has significant control over the direction of the NLRB and the application of National Labor Relations Act in the workplace. So we're going to see, and we've already seen significant changes. The new acting general counsel, Peter Orr, has come in and immediately revoked a number of guidance letters and so on. He rescinded 10 of Rob's memos, describing them as inconsistent with the National Labor Relations Act's stated goal of encouraging. And this is one of the kind of telling statements here, is that they stated that these memos were inconsistent with the NLRA's goal of encouraging collective bargaining and protecting workers' rights. And so you can see that the Biden administration definitely has a perspective here that is relatively employee-friendly, union-friendly, seeing the NLRA as focused on encouraging collective bargaining, not necessarily the strict neutrality that you as employers may hope. So there's definitely a new sheriff in town, and it's going to be there are going to be significant changes that we're going to see over time. Next slide, please.
So I think that's our time, but I think that's a good note to end on, that,
Yeah.
and we had put some slides together and things are so quickly changing that, it's hard to keep track, but, I think that the sentiment that you just expressed, that, there's a new sheriff in town that's going to be much more labor friendly, many changes will come. So Stay tuned.
Thanks, Liani.
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost track of the time there. All
No
right.
problem. So thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure.